Hi, it's Shanna Borders, and today I just wanted to talk to you guys about the book Unholy Ghost by Nell Casey. And this book is a book written on depression. It's a compilation of memoirs written by people who have suffered from depression itself, so you really get a nice firsthand point of view into that disorder. This book is about 290 pages. It's a pretty thick read if you can look at it, but it ended up being a pretty good book. The only critique I have of it is that a lot of the wording style is a little bit more difficult to read. So if you're not an advanced reader and you want to read this book, you may want to set aside a little extra time to read it because your average rule of time for reading a book may not apply. For instance, it took me an hour just to read 30 pages out of this book when usually, I can read a page per minute. So just be forewarned of that. And there are a lot of interesting themes in this book. They all cycle around depression, of course, but some of the common themes were usually experiences you can see in people that have dealt with depression. These themes are themes of experiencing dissociation. You feel outside your body. You feel like you're not a part of this world. Some of the people who wrote in the book expressed how they just felt outside of themselves, and they felt like they didn't feel like themselves. They felt that they couldn't enjoy their everyday activities. There was a man in the book who was talking about how he couldn't even enjoy reading books, an activity that he always did. After a life-changing surgery, it's just interesting how little things can change your mindset, and the different authors in this book go on to talk about their individual experiences on how they came to experience depression, how they dealt with their depression. And there are other themes of inadequacy and suicidal ideation, if not suicidal attempts. People with depression, especially the people in this book, they felt like they might not have been as much of a person or as important or as good as other people, and they felt like they might have been a burden on the people in their lives. They felt like taking their life was just the only option. And some of the writers even expressed suicide as being something, they were just like, hey, some people want to take their lives for various reasons. It is what it is. I've accepted it as part of the disease process. It just, that amazed me how, I guess, chill you can be about such a serious topic. But I guess when you're experiencing yourself, you've thought about it yourself, you've learned to just live with this disease, you come to think those thoughts are normal. And that's what kind of takes you on a loop in this book is, as a person who might not suffer from depression, or a person who might not suffer from as severe of depression as these writers, you can see into their perspective. And, as a person that doesn't have this diagnosis, you're thinking this thought process might be a little off. And some of the writers chose to be medicated, some of the writers did not. They just said, they learned how to maintain it without medication. They learned to accept it and deal with it as it is, and it's become part of their identity. Some did not. Some had other disorders along with depression to where they had to be medicated with various medications, not just one, to function in everyday life. And but one common theme that I saw in all the writers pretty much was they understood that depression was a part of who they are, and obviously they're all open and willing to talk about their experiences with depression. They're very open, and I think this book is kind of a way for those wanting to know more about depression, those who may be thinking they're suffering from depression, to kind of see that, other people have these thoughts, they go through these things, this is how they dealt with them. But on the other side, if someone is dealing with depression and decides to read this book, it depends on your own discretion. Some of it might just hit a little bit too close to home, so I would just go carefully if you want to read it. Other than that, I think it's a very informative book for an outsider to look into and really try to understand the process of depression. And I just want to read some of the passages that were really moving to me through this book. I've got a couple of them. Some are just, one or two sentences. Some are a whole paragraph. But it just makes you think. It's just crazy. Okay. So this man is speaking on some possible suicidal and homicidal ideations that him and his friend have going on. And as a person who has suffered from depression, as a person who knows people who've suffered from depression, I can see where this thought process is coming from. I can understand it. But it's kind of heartbreaking, and it's different to see how their minds work. So he starts off by speaking about his friend, and then he speaks a little bit more about himself. He says, "A friend of mine, a peaceable soul who has been riding the New York subways for 30 years, finds himself stepping back from the tracks once in a while and closing his eyes as the train rolls in. This," he says, "is not only to suppress an urge to throw himself in front of it, but because every couple of weeks an impulse rises in him to push a stranger onto the tracks. Any stranger, thus ending his own life too. He blames this partly on apartment living, pigeonholes without being able to fly." So you can see some of the creative language they use. But, this man has homicidal and suicidal tendencies. He can't even do a normal thing like wait on the subway without having these feelings. He has to step back and close his eyes to try to suppress those thoughts. Something that most people don't have to worry about doing. And then the author of this, he comes to speak about his own experience, and he says, "It is profoundly startling not to trust oneself after decades of doing so. I don't dare keep ammunition in my country house for a small rifle I bought secondhand 2 decades ago. The gun had sat in a cupboard in the back room with the original box of 22 bullets under the muzzle all that time, seldom fired except at a few apples hanging in a tree every fall to remind me of my army training near the era of the Korean War, when I'd been considered quite a marksman. When I bought the gun, I didn't trust either my professional competence as a writer or my competence as a father as much as I came to, but certainly believed I could keep myself alive. I bought it for protection, and the idea that someday I might be afraid of shooting myself with the gun would have seemed inconceivable, laughable." That's kind of relatable because we think, too, that, we're not going to think of these thoughts. He said that thought was laughable. He was a trained military man, and he bought it to protect himself. And with the progression of depression, he started thinking about how the gun could be used to kill himself, and it's a difficult thought, and he never thought he would think it. He said, "Oh, that's laughable. Like, I never thought I would be thinking this way," and he literally has to hide his own ammunition and gun from himself because those urges of suicide are so strong. Another passage I want to read is, "I don't rule out suicide as being unthinkable for people who have tried to live full lives. And don't regard it as negating the work and faith and satisfaction and fun and even ecstasy they may have known before. In killing himself, a person acknowledges his failures during a time span when perhaps heaven and earth had caught him like a pair of scissors, but doesn't repudiate his lifespan. Man is different from animals in that he speculates, a high-risk activity. So this author says that, they can kind of understand where people who take their own life come from. He's trying to understand. He's not just judging them. And he discusses how humans are the only species that overthink things and get into their own minds. And depression is very much a disease where your mind takes over you and these thoughts get ahead of you. And that's why I said it's such a dangerous activity. Okay, so this one is more to go with the theme of inadequacy. So this woman, I'm just going to shortly summarize it. She had to go live with someone else. So she was feeling a little bit like a burden in this passage. They slept on the other side of French doors, and the form of their bodies under the blanket, spooned together, made me feel like a disembodied spirit. They were vital people with an apartment and a singular, loving relationship. I had killed myself and was only a ghost now, come back to lurk around and mooch off of their young lives. Notice how she used the word vital to express them. She doesn't believe that she is vital, but she believes these people are vital because maybe they seem more successful than her at that point in life, and she just thinks she's, just a, hollow shell, a ghost of a human there to just mooch off of them. She feels like a burden, even though I'm sure those people weren't seeing it as that. That also kind of ties in a little bit with anxiety if I think about it, but depression makes you feel so bad about yourself that you think a simple favor from your closest friend is a burden, which it shouldn't be, and usually it isn't. And then I have one more passage. And this is kind of going with inadequacy too. Wearing the human mask, I stumbled ahead into life, tripping time after time over my own terror. I want so desperately to express myself. I wrote in May 1958, I can't stand this suppression. I want to write, to act, to sing, anything. I can't. I railed against myself for being lazy and disorganized, heartsick over my failure to have the highest marks in my class. I wrote at the beginning of 1959, I feel so inadequate, so small. And more than a year later, if something doesn't happen, I'll scream. I am so empty, so hungering. I know that deep within me lies something, but I see it in comparison with the talents of others, and it is so pitifully small. This girl, she holds herself to such a high standard, and to the standard of other people. She compares herself to others too often, and it makes her feel like she's not enough. She was going through school at the time, and she just felt like she was not doing well at all. And just depression can tell you that. It can tell you you're not good enough. You need to be more like them. You need to be absolutely perfect. It can drive you to perfectionism to the point where you're nitpicking so much at yourself that you're not happy. And when you're not happy, of course, you can't live an effective lifestyle. So overall, I thought this was a very beautiful book, very beautifully written. It was a little bit difficult to read because of, how poetic it seemed, how eloquent the writing was. It wasn't, everyday language. It kind of put a beauty to depression for me. And it really had comparisons that I could relate to, that I could understand. I would highly recommend this book. And my main takeaway was at the end, if you're suffering from something like depression, try to get help, try to work through it, go see a professional, get on medication, do what you need to do to be yourself again, because in the end, depression does take away from who you really are. As you saw from those passages I read, those people weren't as happy as they could be, and they had some very dangerous thinking. So if anyone wants to read this book and understand more about depression, I'd check it out. Again, it's Unholy Ghost by Neil Casey, and he's the editor. Again, it's just a bunch of memoirs by a lot of professional authors who have suffered from depression, and it makes you feel, a lot of people do suffer from depression, and maybe you aren't the only one. It makes you feel like you might have something in common with others, or a community at least, even if it is through a book. So if you want to know more about the book, just let me know and I'll explain more to you. And if you want to borrow this book, you can too. Thank you.